Hello and welcome everybody. I am Mark Fuccio. Welcome to another Drobo webinar. We're very fortunate to have today two special guests who are experts about iTunes, and we're looking to share a lot of information with you. We're going to try to keep this to an hour. Sorry for a couple minute delay in getting started. But first, what I'd like to do is introduce our special guests. First we have Doug Adams, who's well known for his Doug scripts, for all manner of Apple scripts for managing iTunes libraries. And with him, his podcasting co-host is Kirk McElhearn. And Kirk is well known as a writer for senior editor for Macworld magazine, as well as he's has his own blog, and he's written numerous books for Tidbits and their Take Control series. And he has written books literally about iTunes, and he's the iTunes guy. So that's what we're here today. What I'd like to do is just start off and just a little bit. How do you guys meet each other, and how long? Was it iTunes that Common Interest that pulled you guys together to start your the Next Track podcast?
You want to?
We met on an online dating site about 15 years ago. About a dozen years ago. No, I guess we just got to know each other because I'm trying to think. I was writing about iTunes already more than 10 years ago, and I was working as a guest editor for macOS 10 Hints, the now defunct website, and we probably got to know each other around then, and I had been using Doug's Apple scripts to manage my iTunes library.
You had emailed me. I think I even have the first email you sent me. And you were asking me, yeah, I save everything. And I think you would ask me about a script and if it could be modified to do something or another, and we pretty much stayed in communication after that because you were working at Macworld at the time. You're doing macOS 10 Hints. I think I'd also bought a couple of your books, so you were already on my radar. So we've just been pals since then.
You still have my 2004 iTunes book on your shelf back there. Doug shows it to me every once in a while when we're recording a podcast. I don't know if I sent that to you or if you bought it. If you bought it, I thank you.
I really bought it. At a bookstore, at a brick-and-mortar bookstore, probably Barnes & Noble or something like that.
Yep.
I used to like that about. You'd always find me at the Barnes & Noble. They had like a 6-foot space of computer books. That's always where I would be. Just any new ones.
Cool, good. So
about 6 months ago, we were talking about what we could do to do something, and we decided to do a podcast. And so we do a podcast called The Next Track. Actually, it's more than 6 months. We're up to episode 30.
Right.
It's called The Next Track, and it's about the way people listen to music today, and we talk about music, we talk about iTunes, we talk about audio equipment, and we're very happy that Drobo has sponsored some of our episodes recently. So if you haven't checked it out, it's at thenexttrack.com, and I'm sure that Mark's going to put a link or something someplace later.
yes, I've started listening to it. It's really great. There's a wide diversity of topics, and one thing I appreciate is it's very short and punctual, generally no longer than 30 minutes. Sometimes it's had special guests, so it runs a little long at 40 minutes, but it's very digestible in one sitting, one drive, one commute. So really great content, and it's very well produced for great audio. So what I'd like to do is pass it over to our guests. They have some introductory comments just to set the stage for what iTunes is and isn't, and why it maybe has some of the complexities and mysteries that it does.
Yeah, I wanted to start out by just giving a brief statement about iTunes that I think is really important to understand when you're trying to do things in iTunes. iTunes is a database. Think about that. iTunes is a database. That's all it is. I mean, it plays audio, it's got the iTunes store and all that, but it's a database. You're managing files that are someplace on your computer or on an external storage device, but it's just a database. iTunes lets you separate yourself from organizing the files. You organize everything in iTunes, and iTunes handles the rest. Now, I know that some of you are probably thinking, oh no, but I have to organize my files and folders myself and all that. And you can do that. You're allowed to. But the two things happen. One is you spend an awful lot of time, and the second thing is that sometimes iTunes loses track of things because it's just a database. It doesn't know when you move files like that. Doug and I both get a lot of email. I get email particularly for the column that I write for Macworld every 2 weeks called Ask the iTunes Guy. And an awful lot of the questions I get that can't be resolved with Doug's Apple scripts are things that are caused by people sticking their hands under the hood. So unless you really have a reason, don't do it. You'll save yourself a lot of time and trouble. Let iTunes manage things. Let iTunes organize things. We'll explain later how you can put your media files onto a Drobo if you don't have enough space on your hard drive. But don't put your hands under the hood. iTunes is a database. That's all it is. Okay, it plays. It's got the store, right? And you're gonna and there are 11 of you thinking, well, iTunes is really bloated. And that's a discussion for another day. But iTunes is a database. And just remember that when you think about how you're working with iTunes, that each entry for a track or a video is like a database record. It's got information that lets you get information about the file and lets iTunes manage the file in Smart Playlist, but it's just a database.
Yeah. One of the things that we wanted to talk about was that we get a lot of email, as Kirk mentioned, and people email us their problems because they see that we provide lots of solutions. And a lot of the mistakes that people make that get them into trouble are because they make assumptions about the way iTunes works. And one of my favorites is that people, the question I've been getting a lot lately is, I'd like to be able to find all the tracks from an album that are missing. And there's really no way of doing that because, first of all, iTunes doesn't really know what an album is. iTunes inherently only knows what an iTunes track entry is and what a playlist is. And everything else kind of descends from that. So the whole idea of there being an album is simply a database query that find all the tracks that have the same text in the album tag. That's what an album is to iTunes. You can't just say, in AppleScript anyway, or any kind of coding language, I want to find just this album. You have to say, find all the tracks that have this as an album name. And that makes it very difficult to manage albums the way you manage LPs or CDs, whereas CDs and LPs were the smallest unit you could have. But in digital music, the smallest unit you can have is a file or a track entry in our case. And a lot of times people can't shake off this, what I call the LP paradigm or the CD collection paradigm, and get into the digital paradigm, and that is that there are tracks, and that's all there are. And anything else other than tracks, albums or collections or artist groupings, are all done by algorithm or by a query to the database. So as Kirk said, thinking of it as a database with individual items, like your contacts, like your address book or something. iTunes is more like your address book than a music player is. And I think once you grasp that, you'll be able to understand how you can keep things organized better and how to work with it better. No two people use iTunes the same way is what I always like to say, because it seems whenever I'm asked a question and people describe to me their setup, I have to kind of shake my head and forget how my setup is and try to understand how their setup is. And then another person will ask, and their setup is completely different from the person solutions, because iTunes is so flexible, and with the appearance of it being so flexible, you begin to think that you can do anything with it, and you really can't. So our first rule is iTunes is a database of track entries. That's what I wanted to get off my chest.
Okay. So one question that we've received is the person says, I have a large set of music files. Is there an easy way to tag them and bring them into iTunes? I don't know. I guess maybe this person descends.
Right. So I'm assuming this. Yeah, I'm assuming this person has a folder with a lot of files in it.
Yes.
So this is a big problem. It's probably less of a problem because I think there's fewer people who download things indiscriminately. Although I remember when I was a member of eMusic some years ago, the files were very badly tagged, and so these were, legal downloads that I was getting, and it was a real mess. Here's what I do. I have a playlist in my iTunes library called Temp, T-E-M-P. You could call yours, Billie Holiday or or my desktop or whatever you want. And this playlist is empty unless I'm tagging something. So if I've got a big folder of files that I'm bringing into my iTunes library, I don't just dump them in the library. I dump them in that playlist so I can sort it by different columns. I can see what tags are there and what tags aren't. And I can work on these files, in many cases using Doug's Apple scripts, without having to search them in like a recently added playlist. And this is something I recommend to everyone, no matter what you're doing. If you're ripping CDs even, don't just click the import button. Select all the tracks on the CD interface in iTunes, drag them to the left side. The sidebar comes out and drag them on this playlist. And then you'll be able to change the tags afterwards without having to search for them. You'll be able to add artwork if you want. I think the second part of the question is, what if these files aren't tagged correctly? There used to be some tools that can do that, and I don't think they work very well anymore. Doug, any ideas?
Well, yeah, you hear this a lot. It'd be nice to imagine that there's a nice public database somewhere with all the information about all the files that you'll ever download. And there used to be. GraceNote used to be public. There's CTDB library used to be public. There's the free DB database, which is still available, which is kind of awkward to use because you have to download it in order to access it. And it's every album ever recorded. So that's awkward to work with. GraceNote is now in the business of charging for access to their databases. So large companies will use them. We suspect that Apple has a contract with GraceNote to some degree, and other companies do that provide music, Spotify, probably places like that, so that the music is tagged appropriately. But as far as accessing it yourself, there's really no easy way of doing it. I still go to places like Discogs and on my web browser and just look at the names and type things in. I mean, I used to have a script that would scrape the Discogs page, but they changed the format of the HTML and the format of their web pages so frequently, it was just difficult to keep up with it. So that's really the only thing you can do, other than asking iTunes to, use its GraceNote database to tag your stuff. So the only thing you can really do is try to find the source material yourself, either on Wikipedia or Discogs or AllMusic Guide or whatever source of information you use for your albums, and really just eyeball it and enter it by hand. Luckily, Apple Scripts can help you with that. But I mean, also using the MultiItem edit feature of track editing in iTunes, that shortens the thing up. Of course, you still have to name track names one by one, but generally all the other album information you can enter in one swoop in the multi-item edit.
This is something we found out, both of us recently, working with some correspondents, that a lot of people don't know that you can edit multiple items in iTunes. They think you can only edit one at a time. So if you select a single track or a film or an audiobook or any item in iTunes, and you press Command-I on Mac and Control-I on Windows, you get an info window. But if you select, say, 10 tracks of an album and press the same keyboard shortcut, you get an info window that lets you edit all of the tags for all of those tracks, with the exception of the name tag, because you can't name every track with the same name.
Kirk, that's a little abstract. Could you show us on a screen? So
I can show you that. You know what? Okay, so let's figure out how to do this here. I'm going to show my screen. So here I've got a Grateful Dead album. If I select the first track and press Command-I, this is the info window. So you see things like the song, the artist, the album, the genre, the year, the track number, etc. There are tabs in here for tags like artwork and lyrics, options, sorting, and all that. So this is for a single song, okay? Now if I select all of these 11 tracks and I press Command-I again, notice that the info window is a little bit different. There's no song tag, it's just artist, album, and genre. So if I wanted to change the artist here, I could just type over, or assuming that it's blank because I've just imported some files, if I want to change the album name, etc., you just type in what you need and you click OK, and it changes all those tracks. So you can do this for a single track, and you can do this for as many tracks as you want.
Okay, great. So another question we have is someone's asking about easiest way of saving iTunes library if they're going to be rebuilding their computer. I guess rebuilding means probably doing an OS upgrade.
on the Mac, all of the files in your iTunes library are in your user folder, in the music subfolder, in the iTunes subfolder. So if you were to just copy that folder, the user/music/iTunes, you'll have all the files you need. There's an exception to that. I'll get to that in a second. In Windows, I'm not exactly sure of the file path. I believe in my documents/music/iTunes, something like that. You'll have to look it up. Now, one thing to know is that if you have put your media files on an external drive or on a Drobo, then your media files will not be in that folder. They'll be on your external device, and you don't need to worry when you're setting up a new computer. But that folder, it contains a number of subfolders. It contains an album artwork folder. It contains a cache folder. It contains an iTunes library.itl file. That's the main library file for the iTunes database, and it's got some other files. But everything is in that folder, and everything should be in that folder. And don't ever move anything out of that folder manually, please. iTunes is a database, remember.
Okay, so along that line, we had one question that was asking about, I interpreted the question one of two ways. It's asking about using a library with multiple computers, and I'm not sure if they're asking about just sharing the access and the media on different machines, or or if they're asking about sharing an iTunes library in a home or a family situation.
One of the things that you have to be very careful about if you think you can use one set of music of media files and one database file with a group of iTunes is that iTunes doesn't work that way. iTunes, your single application of iTunes is looking for one iTunes library ITL file. That's one database file. If another one is using the same one, they're going to be fighting all the time. And if you add music to one iTunes on one machine, it's not automatically going to be added to the iTunes on the other machine. They both have to be they both have to be manually added to the iTunes, or you could use some kind of automation. But it's not automatically going to happen. So the best thing to do is to use home sharing. For this situation, you can still access the files on the other machine from your local iTunes and drag files between the two machines. But trying to set it up in such a way that they share one library, it can be really bad. You could do it if you were sure that no other copy of iTunes would ever be on while you were using the one. But if you had several of them open and changes were being made, so don't forget that whenever you play a track in iTunes, iTunes is updating the database with the play counts and the play date and stuff like that. That's not going to update the information on the other iTunes. Well, actually, it might.
No,
but
no.
If they're running at the same time, there will be a conflict. I mean, I could give you other examples, but there will be a conflict. So really the best thing to do is some kind of home sharing or iCloud Music Library, which I know people feel funny about. But there are easier ways to do it than trying to do it with just a single library in one location.
Okay, so
I get this question a lot, and I've long hoped that Apple would make an iTunes server. Imagine you've got a family and you want to put all your music on one. You want everyone to be able to access it, but everyone to make their own playlists and all, and it's just not built like that. So let me just give you a quick demonstration. Doug was mentioning home sharing. So I'm in my iTunes library on my iMac, and I've got my MacBook on the side. So if you click this menu here, this is what's called the Media Picker. If you have home sharing turned on, you'll see any other libraries at the bottom of the list. The name of my computer is Pequod. So if I select this, you'll see that iTunes very quickly loaded the library, and I can now play any of the music from my laptop on this computer. What this means in a home situation is, let's say you do have a single computer and you want all the music, but no one is going to have music on their computer, so you can access the other iTunes library and you can play the music without having to have it local. The advantage to this is you don't need to have the files, so you save the space of not having the files on your computer. But one person has to manage this library. So if you've got a family and people want to add music, they have to give it to the administrator, and
everybody knows who the administrator is. Everybody has the IT. Who's the IT dad? I mean,
yeah. If you don't have someone, if you don't have someone who wants to do it, and believe me, it can be a bit complicated, you're better off not doing it.
Okay, so along similar notes, we have questions regarding using either direct attach or maybe network Drobo, and one is there any capacity limits in iTunes, and which one would you recommend if you have a 6 terabyte iTunes library? That must be a lot of video as well as a lot of audio in that.
Yeah. So the first thing, iTunes is a database. If you haven't remembered that, I think I'm going to put that on our Next Track podcast T-shirts.
When we make T-shirts.
It doesn't matter if you have 6 terabytes or 1 terabyte. What's important is the number of items that are in the database. So as you said, Mark, someone could have a lot of videos. They could have 6 terabytes of videos. Let's say each video is several gigabytes, a film in HD. That's not a lot of files. What matters is the number of files. Now, I actually, in my last Ask the iTunes Guy column for Macworld, I addressed the question of, is there a limit to the number of items you can have in an iTunes library? And I said that I knew of people who have 200,000 and 300,000 track libraries, and they have no problems. And I got a comment on my website from someone who has 384,000 tracks. Now, if you have more than that, raise your hand. I think you're the 1% of the 1%. So you really don't need to worry about the amount of the number of tracks. It's the amount of data that's a problem. So if all you have is music, 384,000 tracks, that's going to be a bunch of terabytes. I'm guessing it's going to be, so if I extrapolate from my library, that would be about 5 or 6 terabytes if your music is iTunes Plus, so 256 kbs. If you've got videos, you're going to have even more. So the question was advantages to using an attached device or a network device. The attached device has to be connected to the computer. So if you have the space and you want it to be connected to the computer, that's certainly an advantage. The network device you can put anywhere. If it the first time that you copy all the files, you're going to want to connect it anyway, because if you're connecting even over gigabit Ethernet, it'll take weeks if you have that many files. Okay, days, not weeks. But once you've done that, it's just as easy to use a network device because it's out of the way. I have I'm in my office right now. I have a 27-inch iMac, a 12-inch MacBook, and in a room across the hall, I have a Mac Mini server which has a disk connected to it for some of my media files, and I don't need them locally. The only thing the only problem you would have with a network device is, let's say you are syncing a new iPhone or resyncing because you had to restore your iPhone. iTunes is going to have to copy all those files over the network, and it'll be slower if it's a network device than if it's an attached device.
One of the things I don't know a lot about using servers. I don't have one set up, but I hear from people who have them set up, and I often hear about the problems they're having, and I think I would suggest that you should know the disk format that you're using. If, for instance, if the format of your disk is not going to handle more than 255 characters and you happen to have a very unusual file that has a very long file name, that will screw up the whole thing, and you'll have to go weed that guy out and figure out which one is causing the file name problem. But issues like that, make sure you know how your disks are formatted before you start moving terabytes and terabytes of music over. I mean, it's an unusual situation to see a file name bigger than 255, but sometimes you never know. Some naming conventions, they incorporate they try to incorporate as much information as possible in the file name, and I can easily see how, some files, video files too, sometimes often have very, very long file names. So that sort of thing is something you have to be aware of.
Yeah, or you have deeply nested folders as well that can
exactly.
do that. So exactly. I guess there was another related question about that, and it's if somebody has a notebook and they're coming in and out, I guess where should they recommend where should you store, I guess, the iTunes .itl file, for best use? I think the answer should be that's the database. That should be on the machine itself. Yes?
Yeah.
Exactly. You can put it on an external device, but I strongly recommend against it.
It's one of the ways that iTunes, the multiple library function works is by creating a new ITL and XML file elsewhere. But I think the best place to keep them is in your local home folder, and then you can move your media files anywhere. You can tell iTunes wherever your iTunes media folder is. So that's the best thing to do. But I'm kind of against putting the whole shebang off the local computer.
Let me give a demonstration of that. So get the screen back on. On my iMac, my media is on an external hard drive, a 4 terabyte hard drive. So if I go to iTunes Preferences and I go to Advanced, you can see here the iTunes media folder location. I think, can I zoom in like that? Do you see it zoomed? I can't hear anyone. Okay.
Okay, it's a little small.
Is it zooming as I'm zooming?
No.
Okay, well, it doesn't matter. So if you can read this, it says volume/music/iTunes media because the external drive is called iTunes media. If you want to change this, you just click the change button and you select whatever drive it's on, and you click OK, and iTunes will then start moving all of the files. Now, we were talking about, so do you want to use an attached Drobo or a network Drobo? If I were to choose, for instance, another hard drive here, right, I have music and I have other files. If I wanted to move this to another drive, I would select this and click Open, and iTunes would start moving the files. If the device is connected, it'll move at the speed at which it copies files, which is, you know, relatively fast. If it's on the network, however, you could have days of time to do it. So that setting in the advanced preferences is where you choose where your media files are. That does not affect the files, as Doug said, the library files, and the folder I mentioned earlier, the iTunes folder that's in your user, or on Windows it's probably your user documents folder or something like that. They should always stay on the local computer. And I think there's another reason for this is you're more likely to back up your computer than you are to back up your media drive. The iTunes library is constantly changing. Every time you rate something, every time you play something, every time you change a tag, you want it to be backed up to the most recent possible version.
Not only that, on the local file, it'll probably work faster. I mean, it won't have to communicate over an external drive or over a network to update its database. Its database is right there, not far from the application. Well, right there on the local drive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we had another person who said they're just updated from a Gen 1 Drobo with Drobo Share. So, boy, talk about names from the past to a Drobo 5N. So that person just skipped like 3 generations or 2 generations of Drobo there. Thank you very much. And they said, I haven't fired up iTunes yet to rebuild the iTunes library. Is there anything that he or she should do to think about optimizing it for the iTunes library for using the new Drobo?
Not that I can think of. And so in the demonstration I just gave, you just change the location for that folder in the advanced preferences. If you've got both Drobos connected to the computer, the Drobo 1 is selected as the drive for the media files, you change it to the Drobo 5. Do all that movement, as I said, it'll copy all the files to the new location. Now, this is going to take a while if you have a lot of media, but it's a pretty painless operation. It really is.
It's a sure thing, too. Because iTunes will match up the new file locations with the entries in its database so that your playlists won't change, your metadata won't change. It's just the location of the files will change. That's all. You don't have to worry about it yourself. But what I would do, in addition to it taking a long time, I think I would forego even working with iTunes until the files have been copied, just to make sure that things don't get updated or you don't throw a monkey wrench into the gears.
And make sure you don't delete the old files until you've had plenty of time to go through your iTunes library, in case there was a file that didn't get copied. I remember some years ago when I was copying files to a new disk, there were some files with accented characters that didn't get copied. And there were only a handful of them, but there were enough in, some opera recordings that had German names, and they didn't get copied. So you want to make sure that you've got that in reserve just in case.
Great. Okay. Next question, I guess building on this idea of database versus, the media files, the question is, does the, when you quote, get info information, the artist's album, is that embedded back into the audio file, or is it stored only in the iTunes database?
Sometimes. For AACs and MP3s, and I guess Apple lossless files, when you make those changes, I believe iTunes makes a good effort to try to write the data back to the file. Most WAV and most AIF files do not manage metadata, so it won't even bother with those. But I believe for the most part, and it's been my experience that about 99% of the time it does get written back out to the metadata file. You can test it yourself. I mean, you can make a change in a file and then go to the file and then copy it to another machine, or look at it in the Finder and look at it and get info in the Finder and see if any of the basic information has changed. Not all information does get copied, though. For instance, ratings, play counts, last play date, that's atypical metadata, and that won't get written back to a file. But iTunes manages that itself. That's why we said before, let iTunes move the files, because that stuff isn't written to the media files. iTunes manages that in its database. So like I said earlier, when you are moving files, you let iTunes do it, and it will link them back up to the track entries. But so for the most part, again, to re-answer the question, yes, for the most part, most tag data is written back out to the file. Yep.
Just to build on what Doug said, the reason that iTunes doesn't store ratings and last play dates and played counts in the files is because let's say two people are using a computer and they're sharing files with home sharing, as I mentioned earlier, and you want to copy files from one computer to another. Well, Doug doesn't want my ratings on the files that he copies from my computer. He doesn't want my play counts. He wants to, build his own play counts himself. So these are the more personal things. The only other thing to know about this is the way iTunes deals with artwork. Artwork is technically a tag. If you manually add artwork, as I did before in the info window, if you just click on the artwork tab and drag a graphic there, iTunes embeds it in the file. If, however, you download something from the iTunes Store or from Apple Music, the artwork is not embedded in the file. It's in that folder I talked about where your iTunes library is, in an album artwork folder. So that means if you pull those tracks out, they will not have the artwork embedded. Doug has a script called embed album artwork, which can actually embed the artwork in the files.
Right, it just goes to the effort that you would make of copying. Well, actually, it's not something that you can do very easily, because you can't redrag the artwork. But Apple Script can say, take the data in the artwork property and put it in the artwork property, and that tricks iTunes into putting the artwork image data into the metadata file. So it's very handy.
Okay, so I guess we have another database question. It says, from a playlist to get everything into one album, which field needs to be the consistent one?
From a playlist to get everything into one album, well, it would have to be the album field. I don't really understand the question.
I think they're. I would interpret it as maybe they have a whole bunch of items
if you wanted to convert if you wanted to make a playlist seem like an album, all you need to do is to change the album tag and call it. Select them all, Command I, in the album field, just type my playlist or something like that and click OK. But that's going to change the album name for all those tracks. So if you look at it outside the playlist, it will still have that name. You can't have an album name in a playlist and another album name elsewhere in the library.
Right. Tracks inside of a playlist are just copies. They're not even copies. They're more like aliases, really.
Yeah. Or shortcuts in Windows.
Right. If you're understanding about databases, you know that databases have tables, and tables can have faux tables that are joins of other tables, and that's essentially what a track entry is in a playlist. It's just an alias to the library file. So if you change any track in a playlist, you're really changing it everywhere in iTunes, and no matter how many playlists it's in or the library that it's located in. The interesting thing too, if you're that's an interesting idea about taking all the tracks in a playlist and making them an album, because you might want to do that if you're dragging disparate tracks and you want to assemble them as an album. The other things you have to make sure you change is not only the album name, but you may want to consider renumbering the track numbers, and you may want to consider adding the track count and things like that that are other that are things that make an album an album. The funny thing about iTunes, I'm going to start getting esoteric here, but the funny thing about digital media files is that the information about the album is contained in each track of the album. It's almost like a fractal. It's like if you chop off a track from an album, you still know what album it came from, and you still know who the artist is, and you still know the genre and the year it was, because it's contained in the information of the track. So it's not like an album, like I was talking about before, that single unit where, well, this is one CD, it came out in 1968, and it's by this artist, and the name of the album is this. It's each track has information about the album. So if you're going to create an album out of tracks, you have to make sure that each track contains the pertinent information about that particular album.
And Doug mentioned renumbering the tracks, so he has an Apple script called Albumize Selection. You select all the tracks and you click it, and it applies the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 in the order in which the tracks appear in the playlist. However, if you don't number the tracks, they will show up in your iTunes library outside of that playlist in alphabetical order. So you'll have Born to Run before Sympathy for the Devil, and if you want it the other way, you have to number them.
Right, or if you had, I don't know, say, a symphony or something, you'd have movement 1, 2, 3, 4.
Exactly.
You have, Beethoven, Symphony 7, movement 1, 2, 3, 4, and then those are each the individual track names, and those could be used in that. What was it? What was the name of that script, Kirk?
Albumize Selection.
Okay, so that would create an album.
Doug invented a word there, albumize.
Yeah, albumize.
He verbed something. That's,
yes, verbing all the time, man.
Right. Okay. So I have another question. I guess this is all of us can answer it. Is this person saying they have Linux and other machines, and they're wondering, is there a Linux version or other way to to share iTunes? I guess there is an open source version of iTunes that it's not the current library. I think it's dated back around version 9, I believe. There's an app. There's a Drobo app that runs on the Drobo, the 5N or the 810N. It's available, runs on other NAS servers in the marketplace. And I know from a colleague at Apple, I guess way back when, once upon a time, iTunes was licensed to a partner. And I guess going up to some event at either a WWDC or an Apple launch event, Steve Jobs asked somebody about this, and he said, well, they told him the story, and Jobs apparently said, well, he wasn't angry. He said, okay, this was vetted. We've got the right internals, right approval inside of Apple, but let's make sure this doesn't happen again. So, I think after that, there's been a number of cat and mouse updates between the Apple changing the formats and the app getting updated. So to the user's question, to my knowledge, this app works, but it will work only for music. It doesn't have the extensions and support to handle video and books and the like. So I'd pass over to either you, Doug or Kirk. Are you aware of other iTunes server tools or of any tools that operate clients on Linux systems?
I'm not aware of any. In fact, I'm rather surprised to hear about the one that you mentioned, because, like you say, Apple's pretty tight when it comes to that sort of thing. But I'm not aware of anything like that. In fact, to be honest with you, I'm not even too familiar with the Windows version of iTunes. I've got my head so far into Macs that I'm not even aware of Windows stuff. Kirk, are you familiar with the Linux stuff?
No, I've never heard of that before. I am more familiar with the Windows version, which is almost the same as the Mac version. But I've never heard that there was a Linux version or any other iTunes, so that kind of surprises me. I wonder if it's just a sort of a copy of iTunes, which is certainly possible. I mean, after all, iTunes is a database, so all you need to do,
right? Yes.
all you need to do is reproduce the the user interface, which is a pretty common user interface, you know, a sidebar and a list on the right. But no, I've never heard of that.
You'd really only need to access the XML file, and then you could really pretty much have access to everything in the current iTunes database. But of course, you need to have that locally. And if you're running Linux, I don't know. I guess you're going to have to jump over to a Mac operating system and grab. So I'm not really sure how that would work.
Right. Okay. Another question: when digitizing or when ripping a CD, are there best settings and why?
Yeah, we discussed this in one of our early podcast episodes. So back in the day, the MP3 file format was developed, and it was a trade-off between quality and storage space. And we had small drives. What was the first iPod? 5 gigabytes. The first iPod was 5 gigabytes. As drive space has become cheaper, it has allowed people to use higher quality files. A long time ago, I did some blind tests. I would rip CDs at different bit rates and listen to them, and I established that 160 kilobytes per second was okay for me.
MP3 or AAC?
AAC. I've always used AAC, so AAC is a bit more efficient and is going to sound a little better at an equivalent bit rate. And this was when we were working with, 40, 60, 80 gigabyte hard drives, so, much smaller than what we have now. I then moved up to 256 a few years ago, and now I rip everything in Apple Lossless. It's not because of the quality, it's because when you've ripped something in a lossless format, like Apple Lossless, you can convert it to another bit rate or another format without losing any quality. So when I rip CDs, and I actually rip a lot of CDs, I make what I consider to be archival copies, which are the ones that I use, but they're also files that are flexible and that you can convert as much as you want. When I sync to my iPhone, I have iTunes convert them to 256K files because I don't really need that quality on an iPhone. And again, I don't rip for the quality. I rip for the convenience of not having to rip again. It's because I have many albums that I had ripped at 160 and I re-ripped at 256. And then I re-ripped in Apple Lossless. I don't want to have to do this 3 times again. So I just rip everything in Apple Lossless now.
Yeah, I've been ripping everything as Apple Lossless or trying to get as much high quality as possible. And one of the things that I like to mess around with is I use a thumb drive in my car to listen to music. I have a 5-year-old car that accepts music on a thumb drive. And so what I'll do is I'll just make copies of the Apple Lossless at like 128, and just every month or so just dump another few hundred tracks onto this thumb drive and just have it in the car. Not to, it's not critical listening. It's just these are the songs I think I'll probably want to listen to. So having the Apple Lossless to be able to convert into disposable 128 copies on this thumb drive is really handy. And of course, when I'm listening at home, when I'm listening critically to my actual collection, I've got the best quality possible. I've got the Apple Lossless. So that's the best way. But you should probably always do the highest quality that you have the room for. If you've got a Drobo, you've got plenty of room. So, I mean, do it as high as you possibly can. If you're just doing voice stuff or audiobooks or things like that, that can be lower quality because that kind of quality, you're not listening to it for the golden tones of the narrator. You're listening to the words that he says or she says. But as far as music goes, go for the highest quality that you possibly can that you've got the room for. That's the rule of thumb I have.
Okay. Next question is about multiple libraries and how do you create them? How do you select between them?
Use multiple libraries, really? I used to do this back in the day when I had 2 different iPods. I had one iPod for my classical music and one for everything else, so 40 gigabyte iPods. So I would switch libraries to be able to sync to the 2 different iPods. You can sync obviously with playlists and selecting things, but this way I would just sync the entire library for each one, and it was easier. It's too much of a hassle to do this, but I will show you how to do it anyway. Now, what I need to do here...
It can be handy if you want to have segregated libraries. I can understand that. I used to have libraries of music, and then I had libraries of sound effects because I do audio production. So, having 2
So I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit iTunes, and I'm going to click on the iTunes icon here. And as soon as I click on it, I'm going to... Come on. No, sorry. I click too late. As soon as you click on it or double-click it in the Finder or in Windows, you need to press the Option or the Alt key, and you get this window that says Choose iTunes Library. If you click Create Library, iTunes lets you create a library with any name you want. It's going to put it in the music folder. And if not, you choose an existing library, which just sends you to the music folder, where you're going to choose if you have another library. Now, I actually have one called Other Music, which is some old music I don't listen to anymore. I'm just not convinced that for normal use, I mean, for this here, the Other Music is archival. So one of the things I do is I review classical CDs. And I've got lots of classical CDs that I've ripped, and I just don't need them in my library, but every once in a while I want to pull them out. So I created that Other Music library. As Doug said, you may have a reason, sound effects, and you're doing things professionally and all that. But other than that, if it's just to segregate music and you want to switch back and forth often, it's a lot of trouble. I mean, there's really room in your iTunes library. I said earlier, someone told me it had 384,000 tracks. So there's room to put an awful lot of tracks in one library.
You know what I worry about when someone says they have that many tracks is how many playlists do you have? And we haven't really touched on it, and I hate to veer a little bit here, but the more playlists you have in iTunes can be difficult too. I always think of playlists as semi-temporary. I mean, technically that's what they are. You create them for temporary purposes, either just to listen to or to burn the CD or whatever. But I know people like to use them as organizational items. For instance, they like to put all their jazz or all their jazz vocals into one playlist, or all their 1950s bebop music into one playlist. But if you get obsessive about things like that and you have a great many number of playlists, it can really bog iTunes down. iTunes is better at it than it used to be, but it's the sort of thing that can bog iTunes down. And a lot of smart playlists also, because they're dynamic.
Yeah, it's the smart playlists that have the biggest hit on iTunes,
yeah.
Because every single time you change something in the iTunes library, whether you've played a track or rated something or changed a tag, iTunes has to write that to the library file and then recalculate all of the smart playlists, which are basically database queries, because iTunes is a database, and all those database queries take time and use resources. So if you have 1,000 normal playlists, it'll affect iTunes a little bit, but if you have 1,000 smart playlists, anytime you change something, iTunes is going to slow down. As Doug said, they have made improvements. I believe it was when iTunes 11 came out. I think the example I gave in my Take Control of iTunes book was that prior to that, my iTunes library ITL file was 150 megabytes, and after that it was 25 megabytes. So they're compressing the file, but maybe they're storing less data or data more efficiently or something like that.
Managing it better, sure.
Yeah.
Can't hear you, Mark.
Okay. To illustrate a final point, we had somebody came in, wrote, I would like to hide my Christmas music except during the season. Is the library the right solution?
I get that a lot, and so why do you want to hide it? Because you don't want to see it? Because seeing it is going to just be so tempting that you want to play it. If that's the reason, drag the files out of the library. But there's a better way to do it. So let me get over to iTunes here. Let me go into, let's see, where is my... See, I've already removed my Christmas music, so I don't even have it.
So Christmas is in 2 weeks. How can you have gotten rid of your Christmas music?
Yeah, I don't do Christmas music. So I'm going to just take an example here. I'm just going to pull an example at random. So world music, right? So if I select all these tracks, Command A or Control A in Windows, and I right-click here, uncheck selection. So if you do that, all of the selected tracks are unchecked, which means that iTunes will not play them. iTunes won't play them if it's shuffling. It won't play them if it's going in order in any way. So if you just want to make sure you don't hear the Christmas music, then you can just uncheck the tracks and do that.
But if you're afraid that every time you see a Christmas song, you're going to run to a Black Friday sale event and go crazy and lose your mind, then that's another problem. That's another show altogether.
Yes,
the other thing too is when you want to hide your Christmas music, what I do is I've essentially just got a couple of smart playlists that I use on a fairly regular basis, and I just always say no Christmas, no holiday genre music, and that's fine for me. I don't mind seeing it. I run up against Charlie Brown Christmas all the time, and I have to ignore it, but I'm pretty good at keeping it out of the way. But that's a great way. Unchecking is a great way of avoiding music altogether to avoid hearing it.
Okay, yeah, I do that in particular so I don't have to hear the Bob Dylan Christmas album. As much as I love Bob Dylan, I think his Christmas album is just an aberration. I did listen to it once because one has to, but I've unchecked the tracks and they will not show up when I...
Glory and honor, we've got...
You sound just as good as Bob. So another related question on sharing or not sharing, is there a way to tag things so that other certain audio files or imported notes or memos that they don't get shared and made available on Apple TV or other devices on the network?
Yeah, so I'm going to do this thing here where I show the screen. So if you can see this, if you go into the iTunes preferences and you click the sharing tab, you see the first entry is share my library on my local network, and the second is share entire library or share selected playlists. Now, the first things that show up as playlists are just what I tend to call libraries: music, movies, home videos, TV shows, etc. Those are the top-level libraries. So if you want to share all your music, you would check this. But then you go down and you have your different playlists. If you want to share only specific music on your library for home sharing, for an Apple TV, etc., you can do this, share selected playlists, and you'll have to build playlists for what you want to share. You can't unshare something. You can't select something and create a playlist and say don't share this, unfortunately. But you can choose to only share what you want.
Okay, that's very, very good. There's a couple other questions coming in, so I think maybe we should summarize, and I'll take a stab at it. And Kirk and Doug, if I have misstated something, then please jump in and correct me. But I guess some of the questions they go back to understanding the difference that the .itl, that's the iTunes library, and that's personal to you. That should be on your machine. And it can reference a Drobo, say a Drobo 5D or a 5C as an external storage that can hold a vast amount of content. If you have a MacBook, as I do, or MacBook Air, if you're maybe plugging in and out, as you're going, when you go wherever you go, and then when you come back to your Drobo and you plug it back in, when you plug it in that way, you have access back to all of those media files. Related issues, if you have a network Drobo, then it's possible a husband and wife that they could access and build playlists referencing the media that's on that shared Drobo, but their playlists and all their intelligence of their iTunes and library, that's in the .itl file on their Mac or their PC. So is this a helpful way to think about it, just building on this concept of iTunes as a database that it also references a physical device that can store where you have your media?
The first thing to note is that when you do this, do not launch iTunes until your Drobo has mounted on your computer. Because if iTunes doesn't find that external drive that's defined in the advanced preferences, iTunes moves its understanding of the iTunes media folder to the location inside that iTunes folder on the computer, which is what iTunes considers to be the default. So make sure the drive is mounted, whether you plug it in or whether it's over a network. Make sure it's mounted first, because
before starting iTunes, make sure the files are available.
Right, because iTunes will scan for those files and not find them, and you'll get these little exclamation points to the left of the names, and that can be hard to fix.
I'm sorry. The reason it does that is because iTunes needs a place to put files if you buy them, if you rip them, or if you convert them. It needs to know where you want these. And if it doesn't have an iTunes media folder to put these things, it says, well, I'm going to use the only place I know, and that's the music folder in your home folder. So it's always going to want a an iTunes media folder. And if the one that you've assigned on your Drobo, on your external drive, on wherever, isn't available, then that's what iTunes will do. It will create another place to put those things. And that's what screws people up. Then, of course, they get all the dead tracks because the files have become disassociated with the track entries. iTunes says these files don't exist. There's all kinds of headaches from that.
Okay, so there's been a couple questions that relate to performance, and I think they fall into two groups. One is in terms of sharing over a network, and do you have any recommendations about wired versus wireless?
Audio files don't take up a lot of space, even if they're Apple lossless, even if they're high resolution. So the effective bit rate that's being transferred over a network is extremely low. I mean, if you can stream HD movies from Netflix, you'll be able to stream a dozen audio files at one time, which is something you'd never need to do. Now, if you are sharing an iTunes library over network and home sharing and several people accessing and you're doing video, then you might run into some network performance issues. I can't imagine a situation, unless you're in a very big house and you have a very old router, where this would actually be a problem. I tend to, Doug and I were just talking about this the other day. He hates wires. I hate wires too, and I've got this spaghetti thing behind my desk of wires. If I can have one less wire, it makes me happy, so I do as much as possible wirelessly.
Okay, and we're coming up on our hour, so final question is just sort of a grab bag summary of what are some of the best practices for getting the best iTunes performance?
Well, so some years ago, you would get a lot of questions about iTunes being slow. As Doug and I both mentioned earlier, if you have a lot of smart playlists, that can slow down iTunes. But other than that, I just don't see this anymore. Even on my laptop, which is not very fast, I don't see any performance issues. If I'm tagging a bunch of new Apple lossless files, well, obviously, iTunes has to read and then write the files, and that takes, a minute or for 100 files. I recently tagged there's a new box set of Bob Dylan's live recordings from 1966, it's 36 CDs, and I recently tagged them, and when I added the album artwork for all the files, it took maybe a minute or two to read and write all the files, but that's the only time you get any performance issues.
I think it's important. I think it's important to have a routine. Go ahead. I'm sorry. You go ahead. You finish your thought.
I was just going to say, if you have a much older computer, obviously this will be different. If you have, if you're going on a USB 2 disk or a slow network, this will be different. But in normal usage, there are no performance issues that I'm aware of.
I think it's important to have a regular routine. For a long time, I used to spend like a half an hour, 45 minutes once a week, every Saturday morning, just doing a little iTunes housekeeping. Nothing amazing, just going through some tracks, seeing if there was anything that had to be fixed, seeing if there were tracks that I didn't want anymore or files that I could eliminate. And after a few years of doing that, I find I don't have to do that anymore, because now I've developed my own set of best practices, which I always follow as far as like ripping CDs or downloading files or acquiring them from elsewhere. So I think you've got to get in the habit of maintaining the library. It's not as easy as like going to the record store and buying a CD and coming home and listening to it. You've really got to kind of nurture your collection along, and I think spending a little time with it just to do housekeeping rather than just listening is probably a good habit to get into and prevent problems down the road.
And I would suggest that you make sure that you tag your files when you add them to your library, and don't wait until you have thousands of files that need to be retagged. It only takes a minute to tag a couple of albums when you've ripped them or added downloads. It takes hours to do it when you've got lots of them.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that. We have just a couple of final Drobo is there an app on the Drobo 5N for playing iTunes? Yes, there is. It's called Firefly. If you go into the Drobo dashboard, you can see it, and you can download it and install it. The caveat about that is, it's sort of from a point in time when the iTunes protocol was disclosed. So it only supports audio. It doesn't support video or other more modern media types. There are a couple other people who have written in. They're sort of long questions. They're sort of hard to parse and digest. They seem about performance and bandwidth. And I just ask those questioners to send me an email, Mark, mfuccio, M-F-U-C-C-I-O @drobo.com, and we can engage a dialogue to figure it out. I think one person talked about Drobo FS and another one about a 5N and or an Apple TV. So with that, we're coming, I think, to the fun part of the program.
Can I just make a closing comment? You've got a Drobo, and it's got really good data protection features in it, but you still need to have a backup of your iTunes library. So back up your Drobo. I don't think you necessarily need another Drobo to back it up, but a very large hard drive. I have my iTunes library on one disk, and I have 3 backups because the number of hours I have spent ripping CDs and tagging them and all that, while I could re-rip them, it would take me years, and I would be very sad if that happened. So back up your Drobo.
Right. So I think on that, there's a whole family of Drobos. The new 5C, Drobo 5C, entry price of US $349. That's an effective way to back up a Drobo to a Drobo, as well as if you want cloud backup. There's providers like Backblaze that for $5 a month will give you as much storage backup space as you need for direct attached units connected to your system. So those are also great plans. We had one other question about using a Drobo 5N. Can it be used for doing Time Machine as well as iTunes, storing the iTunes library? And for that, I give a qualified yes. Sometimes depending on Time Machine when it's running, it may interfere with streaming of music. So in theory, it's possible. That really all depends on what is your usage pattern. There are tools that you can adjust the Time Machine schedule, so instead of running hourly, you can make it run once every 4 hours or once a day or at 2 a.m. so that you don't have that regular interruption coming to your machine. In my own personal experience, I found that since going to a MacBook or MacBook Airs with SSD drives, Time Machine running just doesn't seem to be an issue, but that may be an issue on your machine if it has a spinning mechanical drive inside. For those of you who are interested in the Drobo, either for yourself or as a gift this holiday season, we're offering a special promotion through Kirk and through Doug and their site, The Next Track. This is literally the best promotion of the year. You can get 20% more off of a Drobo 5D, 5DT, any of the 8 or 12 bays, or you get even more, on the Drobo 5N. You can get that for $399. So that's an incredible year-end price. So we urge you to take advantage of that. That has to be purchased at the Drobo store, drobostore.com, and the code that we'd use to get that discount just prior to checkout is TNT20. TNT, The Next Track, which is Kirk and Doug's podcast. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for coming in and sharing time with us. Hopefully we answered a lot of your questions. If you have more follow-up, send them into the email address, and if there's popular demand, we may do this again as part 2. Until then, thank you very much, and have a good day.